The integrity of a democratic state rests upon the unbreakable bond of trust between the governing institutions and the citizens they are sworn to protect and serve. This fundamental social contract faces an existential crisis whenever the state exercises lethal force against an unarmed individual under circumstances shrouded in administrative opacity. The recent discourse within the House Judiciary Committee regarding the fatal encounter between ICE personnel and Renee Good epitomizes this tension between official narrative and visual evidence. Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal has emerged as a vocal critic of the federal response, challenging the foundational claims presented by high-ranking officials during the investigative proceedings. Her interrogation of the facts does not merely seek personal justice for the deceased, but demands a systemic re-evaluation of how truth is curated within the halls of power. The initial reports issued by federal authorities painted a picture of a high-stakes confrontation where an officer faced an immediate and life-threatening physical danger. According to these accounts, the use of deadly force was a regrettable yet necessary reaction to a vehicle being utilized as a lethal weapon. This narrative serves a specific legal function by aligning the incident with established protocols regarding the reasonable fear of imminent bodily harm. However, the introduction of forensic video evidence into the public record has fundamentally disrupted this coordinated depiction of the afternoon's tragic events. By scrutinizing the synchronized footage from multiple angles, independent observers have begun to identify significant discrepancies that challenge the government's assertion of a direct and active threat. A neutral analysis of the visual data reveals a sequence of events that contradicts the traditional imminent danger defense typically employed in such federal use-of-force cases. As the vehicle occupied by Renee Good began to move, the spatial relationship between the car and the officer suggests a trajectory of retreat rather than one of intentional collision. The footage appears to demonstrate that the vehicle was actively navigating away from the perimeter where the officer was positioned at the moment the shots were discharged. This distinction is critical because it shifts the legal and ethical calculus from a defensive maneuver to a potentially unprovoked escalation of violence. If the officer was not in the direct path of the moving vehicle, the justification for utilizing lethal force under federal guidelines becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. Congresswoman Jayapal has utilized this visual discrepancy to argue that the government's insistence on a different version of events constitutes the creation of an alternative reality. This rhetorical framing highlights the danger of institutional gaslighting, where the state uses its vast resources to override the lived experiences and physical evidence available to the public. When official statements are demonstrably at odds with the pixels on a screen, the resulting cognitive dissonance erodes the very foundation of public confidence in the rule of law. The Congresswoman posits that the dissemination of misinformation is not merely a bureaucratic error, but a strategic attempt to shield the institution from the consequences of its actions. Such a practice transforms a single act of violence into a broader assault on the transparency that is essential for a functioning democratic society. The implications of this case extend far beyond the immediate grief of the Good family or the professional future of the officers involved in the shooting. It touches upon the broader pattern of government accountability, or the lack thereof, when dealing with federal agencies that operate with significant autonomy. In the American justice system, the principle of accountability ensures that no individual, regardless of their badge or title, is above the scrutiny of the law. Jayapal's line of questioning suggests that when agencies prioritize self-preservation over the pursuit of objective truth, they jeopardize the legitimacy of the entire judicial apparatus. The systemic failure to address these contradictions fosters an environment where the use of force can be justified through creative storytelling rather than factual necessity. As the debate intensifies, the role of independent oversight becomes the last line of defense against the normalization of administrative deception within federal law enforcement. The call for transparency is not an attack on the mission of the agency itself, but a necessary corrective measure to ensure that mission remains aligned with constitutional values. Without a rigorous and unbiased examination of the video evidence, the precedent set by this case could encourage a culture of impunity across various levels of government. The demand for an accurate accounting of the events is a demand for a return to a reality where facts are not subject to political or institutional convenience. Ultimately, the quest for justice in the Renee Good case serves as a litmus test for the resilience of the American legal system in the face of internal pressure. The discourse surrounding the tragic demise of Renee Good serves as a critical junction for evaluating the federal government's commitment to procedural justice and ethical transparency. In the secondary phase of this analysis, we must examine the intersection of institutional culture and the psychological frameworks that dictate the use of lethal force in high-pressure environments. The government's defense often pivots on the concept of split-second decision-making, a legal doctrine that grants significant latitude to officers acting under perceived stress. However, when this doctrine is weaponized to bypass clear contradictory evidence, it creates a dangerous loophole where accountability becomes a secondary concern to institutional reputation. Congresswoman Jayapal's persistent inquiries highlight that the mere invocation of fear is insufficient to justify the termination of a human life, especially when the physical geometry of the scene suggests an alternative conclusion. A neutral observation of the geopolitical and legal landscape reveals that federal agencies often operate under a veil of qualified immunity that complicates the path to transparency. This legal shield was originally intended to protect officials from frivolous litigation while performing their duties, but its modern application has arguably evolved into a barrier against legitimate scrutiny. In the context of the Renee Good investigation, the tension between this immunity and the public's right to know creates a volatile atmosphere of suspicion. When officials present a narrative that aligns perfectly with the requirements of qualified immunity despite visual evidence to the contrary, they risk appearing as though they are coaching the facts to fit the law. This perceived manipulation of the truth is what Jayapal identifies as a core threat to the integrity of the American democratic experiment. The role of video technology in contemporary oversight cannot be overstated, as it serves as a silent, objective witness in an arena often dominated by subjective human testimony. In this specific case, the pixels captured by surveillance and body cameras do not possess the biases, fears, or self-interest that can color the recollections of those involved in a violent encounter. The divergence between the federal agent's testimonies and the digital recording raises profound questions about the nature of memory and the potential for collective institutional bias. If the officers truly believed they were in danger, we must ask whether that belief was rooted in objective reality or a conditioned response to a specific demographic or situation. Conversely, if the narrative was constructed post-incident to align with legal standards, it represents a calculated subversion of the judicial process. Furthermore, the impact of such incidents on the broader community cannot be ignored, as every instance of perceived injustice ripples through the social fabric, weakening the ties that bind the populace to the state. When a citizen is killed by the very entities designed to uphold the law, the burden of proof for the necessity of that force should be absolute and undeniable. Jayapal argues that the government's failure to provide a consistent and evidence-based explanation for the death of Renee Good sends a chilling message to the public. It suggests that the state's version of the truth is the only one that matters, regardless of what the visual record might demonstrate to any reasonable observer. This dynamic creates a credibility gap that has historically preceded significant periods of civil unrest and institutional reform in American history. The ethical responsibility of the House Judiciary Committee is to ensure that federal power is not exercised with impunity, acting as a vital check on the executive branch's enforcement arms. By bringing these discrepancies to the forefront of a public hearing, The committee forces a confrontation between the administrative state and the principles of democratic oversight. This process is essential for maintaining the checks and balances that prevent the descent into a system where might makes right and truth is a casualty of bureaucracy. The scrutiny applied to the Renee Good case is a reflection of a growing demand for a radical transparency, where every exercise of state violence is subjected to exhaustive public review. Only through such a rigorous process can the government hope to regain the trust it has lost through decades of opacity and inconsistent reporting. As we delve deeper into the investigative reports, the nuances of the vehicle's movement and the officer's positioning become the focal point of a complex legal battleground. The technical analysis of the footage requires a dispassionate look at the timing of the shots relative to the car's speed and direction. If the car was already moving away at a significant distance when the trigger was pulled, the argument for immediate self-defense collapses under the weight of Newtonian physics. This is the reality that Jayapal insists must be acknowledged by the federal authorities if they are to maintain any semblance of moral authority. Ignoring these physical facts in favor of a prepackaged narrative is an act of institutional hubris that the American public is increasingly unwilling to tolerate. The broader implications for federal law enforcement training and policy are also under intense review as a result of this high-profile congressional scrutiny. If the current training protocols allow for such a wide interpretation of danger that it includes a retreating vehicle, then the protocols themselves may be fundamentally flawed. A system that prioritizes the use of lethal force over de-escalation tactics in scenarios involving vehicles is a system that will inevitably produce more tragedies like that of Renee Good. The Congresswoman's critique serves as a catalyst for a necessary conversation about the evolution of policing in an age where every action is recorded and analyzed. It demands a shift from a culture of compliance through force to one of accountability through truth, ensuring that the state's power is always tempered by the ironclad requirements of the law. The erosion of public trust is not a sudden collapse but a slow, rhythmic decay accelerated by repeated instances of institutional obfuscation and the denial of objective reality. When Congresswoman Jayapal characterizes the government's narrative as the creation of an alternative reality, she points to a sophisticated mechanism of psychological and political control. This mechanism functions by saturating the public sphere with a specific version of events that, while contradictory to visual evidence, carries the weight of official authority. In the case of Renee Good, the persistent defense of an officer's actions in the face of contrary video footage suggests that the institution prioritizes its own structural survival over its moral obligations. Such a strategy may provide short-term legal protection for individual actors, but it inflicts long-term damage on the collective belief in a fair and impartial justice system. The concept of a parallel reality in political discourse occurs when state actors use their platform to redefine the meaning of observable facts to suit a desired legal outcome. In this scenario, the movement of a vehicle is no longer a matter of physics and geometry but a subjective interpretation filtered through the lens of professional anxiety. By claiming the officer was in danger when the video shows a retreating car, the government effectively asks the public to disregard the evidence of their own eyes. This demand for blind faith in the face of visual contradiction is a hallmark of authoritarian leanings within a democratic framework, where truth becomes a tool of the powerful rather than a shield for the innocent. Jayapal's critique serves as a necessary intervention, recentering the conversation on the tangible, verifiable evidence that must serve as the foundation for any legitimate legal inquiry. Furthermore, the systemic pattern of misinformation identified by the Congresswoman suggests that the Renee Good incident is not an isolated failure of communication but a symptom of a broader cultural malaise. Within many federal agencies, there exists an unspoken pact of silence and mutual defense that often supersedes the duty to provide transparent reports to the legislative branch. This culture of insularity creates an environment where misleading statements can be vetted and disseminated with little fear of internal repercussion or meaningful oversight. When these statements are eventually debunked by independent investigations or leaked video footage, the damage to the agency's credibility is often irreparable. The public is left to wonder how many other official truths are merely convenient fictions designed to avoid the discomfort of accountability and the labor of systemic reform. The loss of public confidence has tangible consequences for the stability of democratic institutions, as citizens who feel betrayed by their government are less likely to participate in the civic processes. If the rule of law is perceived as a flexible set of rules that can be bent to protect state agents while being rigidly applied to the citizenry, the social contract begins to dissolve. The integrity of the judicial system depends on the universal application of standards, meaning that if a citizen would be prosecuted for a specific action, an officer must be held to an even higher standard. Jayapal's warning about the threat to the integrity of the justice system is a call to recognize that transparency is not a luxury but a requirement. Without a commitment to the truth, the institutions of justice become nothing more than theaters of power where the script is written by those who hold the weapons. To address this crisis, the legislative branch must move beyond mere criticism and toward the implementation of robust, enforceable standards for federal use-of-force reporting and data transparency. The reliance on internal agency investigations often results in a circle-the-wagons mentality that obscures the facts and protects the status quo at the expense of justice. Independent civilian oversight boards with the power to subpoena evidence and testimony are essential to breaking this cycle of misinformation and ensuring that the truth is brought to light. Moreover, the federal government must adopt a policy of radical honesty, where mistakes are admitted and corrected, rather than buried under layers of bureaucratic jargon. The path to restoring trust is long and difficult, but it begins with a simple acknowledgement of the facts as they are, not as the state wishes them to be. The historical trajectory of American law enforcement has been marred by a recurring inability to reconcile official testimony with the burgeoning reality of citizen-led documentation and forensic science. In the Renee Good case, the government's failure to adapt to a landscape of ubiquitous surveillance suggests a dangerous disconnect between administrative habits and modern evidentiary standards. This disconnect is not merely technological but intellectual, as it reflects a refusal to accept that the era of unquestioned official narratives has come to an end. When Congresswoman Jayapal demands accountability, she is essentially demanding that federal agencies modernize their ethical frameworks to match the transparency required by the 21st century. This modernization is the only way to ensure that the tragic loss of life does not become a catalyst for a deeper, more permanent societal alienation. The psychological impact on the community when a government agency is caught in a faucet is profound and creates a legacy of skepticism that lasts for generations. This skepticism acts as a barrier to effective law enforcement, as communities are less likely to cooperate with agencies they perceive as inherently dishonest or prone to covering up violence. Jayapal's focus on the erosion of trust highlights that the government's misinformation is not a victimless crime. It is a direct assault on the social fabric. By prioritizing the protection of a single officer over the integrity of the truth, the federal government risks alienating the very people it is supposed to protect. The cost of this alienation is far higher than the cost of a transparent investigation that might lead to uncomfortable admissions of error or negligence. The intersection of immigration enforcement and the use of lethal force adds another layer of complexity to the Renee Good tragedy, as it involves agencies with vast, often unchecked power. The rhetoric surrounding border security and internal enforcement often creates a climate where aggressive tactics are normalized and oversight is viewed as an impediment to national safety. However, the death of a citizen under questionable circumstances proves that when oversight is weakened, the safety of everyone is compromised, regardless of their legal status or location. Jayapal's intervention is crucial because it reminds the public that the constitutional protections against unreasonable seizure and the use of excessive force apply to every individual within our borders. The defense of Renee Good's rights is, by extension, a defense of the rights of every American who might find themselves in the path of federal authority. In the pursuit of justice, we must also examine the language used by government spokespeople to sanitize the reality of violence and deflect responsibility. Euphemisms like perceived threat and non-compliant behavior are often deployed to soften the impact of a fatal shooting and provide a veneer of clinical objectivity. Jayapal's insistence on using the video evidence to ground the conversation in physical reality strips away these linguistic shields and forces a direct confrontation with the actions taken. This linguistic deconstruction is a vital part of the democratic process, as it prevents the state from using professional jargon to obscure the moral gravity of its decisions. When we call a retreating car what it is, rather than a vehicular threat, we move closer to a justice system that values clarity over administrative convenience. Ultimately, the resolution of this conflict requires a fundamental shift in how the federal government perceives its relationship with the truth and the public it serves. It is not enough to simply release a video. The agency must be willing to engage with the findings of that video in a way that is honest and self-critical. The legacy of the Renee Good case will be determined by whether it leads to a defensive hardening of institutional barriers or a courageous opening of the investigative process. Jayapal has set the stage for this transformation by refusing to accept anything less than a full and accurate accounting of the events that led to a citizen's death. The future of the American experiment depends on our collective ability to demand that our institutions reflect the values of honesty, transparency, and the pursuit of justice for all. The technical paradox of modern law enforcement training lies in the tension between the instinct for self-preservation and the constitutional mandate for restraint. In the specific case of Renee Good, the federal government's justification often relies on the ODA loop: observe, orient, decide, act, to explain the officer's rapid escalation. However, when the observe phase is clouded by institutional bias or a predetermined fear of the subject, the entire cycle of decision-making becomes inherently flawed. Congresswoman Jayapal's inquiry challenges this cycle by suggesting that the orientation of the officers was not based on the actual trajectory of the vehicle but on a perceived defiance that did not warrant lethal force. This critical distinction forces us to ask whether our federal agents are being trained to see every movement as a threat rather than a potential for de-escalation. The intersection of human rights and domestic policing policy has become a focal point for international observers who view the United States as a bellwether for democratic accountability. When a state agency is caught in a pattern of disseminating misinformation to justify a fatal shooting, it undermines the nation's ability to advocate for human rights abroad. How can the American government criticize the opacity of foreign regimes when its own internal investigations are marked by the same refusal to acknowledge visual evidence? The Renee Good tragedy is thus transformed from a local incident into a global case study on the resilience of democratic oversight in the face of militarized law enforcement. Jayapal's insistence on the truth is an attempt to align American practice with the high ideals of international justice and the universal right to life. Furthermore, the role of civil society organizations in amplifying the findings of the House Judiciary Committee is essential for maintaining pressure on the executive branch. Groups dedicated to civil liberties and racial justice serve as independent auditors of the government's narrative, often providing the forensic expertise needed to deconstruct complex ballistic and video data. These organizations argue that the blue wall of silence has been replaced by a bureaucratic wall of jargon, where legalisms are used to obscure the simple fact of an unnecessary death. By translating the Congresswoman's legislative concerns into public advocacy, these groups ensure that the names of victims like Renee Good are not forgotten in the shuffle of political cycles. This synergy between the halls of Congress and the streets of the community is what keeps the demand for accountability from becoming a mere footnote in history. The psychological impact of this incident on the surviving family and the broader community is a form of secondary trauma inflicted by the state's refusal to provide a transparent accounting. To lose a loved one is a profound tragedy, but to be told by official sources that their death was a justified response to a non-existent threat is a unique form of cruelty. This gaslighting of the bereaved is a common tactic in cases involving state-sanctioned violence, designed to silence dissent and discourage legal challenges through the sheer weight of administrative authority. Jayapal's advocacy provides a voice to those who have been marginalized by the very system that claims to provide them with justice and protection. It reaffirms the principle that the dignity of the individual must always outweigh the convenience of the state, especially when that state has used its ultimate power to end a life. As we examine the legislative remedies proposed in the wake of this controversy, the focus must shift toward the mandatory and immediate release of all unedited video footage in use-of-force incidents. The delay in releasing the Renee Good video allowed the initial, inaccurate narrative to take root in the public consciousness, creating a first impression bias that is difficult to overcome. Transparency should not be a discretionary act of government grace. It must be a mandatory requirement of the democratic process to ensure that the public can judge the facts for themselves. Legislators are now considering bills that would penalize federal agencies for knowingly providing false or misleading information to Congress or the public during active investigations. Such measures would create a tangible cost for the alternative realities that Jayapal has so forcefully condemned during her committee sessions. The evolution of forensic science has made it increasingly difficult for the state to maintain a monopoly on the truth, as independent experts can now reconstruct scenes with terrifying precision. In the case of Renee Good, the ability to map the car's speed, the angle of the shots, and the officer's line of sight through digital recreation has rendered the official story obsolete. This technological democratization of truth is a nightmare for agencies accustomed to working in the shadows or relying on the uncorroborated testimony of their own agents. Jayapal's strategic use of this evidence during the hearing signal a new era of oversight where politicians are as well equipped as the investigators themselves. It marks the end of an era where a badge was a sufficient substitute for evidence, and it ushers in a period where every shot fired must be defended by the cold, hard data of reality. The systemic failure to hold officers accountable for misleading statements also points to a crisis in the internal affairs divisions of federal law enforcement agencies. When an internal investigation ignores video evidence to clear an officer of wrongdoing, it signals to the entire force that honesty is optional as long as the mission is completed. This creates a moral hazard that encourages more aggressive tactics and less regard for the legal rights of citizens, as the consequences for error are effectively non-existent. Jayapal's critique is thus a call for a radical restructuring of how the government investigates itself, moving away from a model of internal protection toward one of external verification. Without this shift, the cycle of violence and misinformation will continue to repeat itself, further alienating the public and weakening the foundations of the republic. Finally, we must consider the long-term historical memory of the Renee Good case and what it says about the state of American democracy in the early 21st century. Will it be remembered as a turning point where the government finally embraced transparency, or as another entry in a long catalogue of unaddressed grievances? The answer depends on the willingness of the judicial system to follow the facts wherever they lead, even if they lead to the highest levels of federal authority. Congresswoman Jayapal has laid the groundwork for a serious reckoning, but the ultimate success of this effort requires a collective commitment from all branches of government to uphold the truth. The integrity of our system is not defined by its perfection, but by its ability to correct its own mistakes and hold itself to the same standards it imposes on the world. The final reckoning for the American justice system in the wake of the Renee Good tragedy lies in its capacity for genuine self-correction and the restoration of a singular, objective truth. In this concluding phase of analysis, we must acknowledge that the battle for accountability is not merely a legal struggle but a cultural one that defines the national character. Congresswoman Jayapal's fierce interrogation of federal officials serves as a microcosm of the broader struggle between institutional inertia and the relentless demand for democratic transparency. The persistence of alternative realities within government reports is a toxin that, if left unaddressed, will continue to paralyze the functionality of our law enforcement and judicial apparatus. To move forward, the state must abandon the fortress mentality that views public scrutiny as a threat to be managed rather than a vital component of a healthy democracy. A future defined by integrity requires a fundamental reimagining of the relationship between the state's use of force and the public's right to comprehensive oversight. This transformation begins with the recognition that no official narrative should ever be considered sacrosanct or beyond the reach of rigorous, evidence-based skepticism. The Renee Good case has demonstrated that even when the machinery of the state is geared towards self-preservation, the truth can still be unearthed through persistent legislative inquiry and forensic bravery. We must establish a new standard where the burden of proof rests heavily on those who exercise lethal authority, requiring them to justify their actions not just through testimony but through corroborating physical data. This shift from a culture of presumed justification to one of demonstrated necessity is the only path toward reconciling the power of the police with the rights of the people. Moreover, the role of the American citizen in this process is one of active vigilance, ensuring that the representatives and institutions they empower remain tethered to the reality of the communities they serve. The outcry surrounding the discrepancies in the Renee Good investigation highlights a growing public sophisticated enough to distinguish between bureaucratic obfuscation and factual reporting. This forensic citizenship is a powerful deterrent against the normalization of government misinformation, as it creates a political cost for those who attempt to rewrite history in real time. Jayapal's work in the House Judiciary Committee is an extension of this civic duty, bridging the gap between the granular details of a police shooting and the grand ideals of constitutional law. As long as there are voices willing to challenge the state's monopoly on the truth, the hope for a more perfect union remains a tangible possibility. The legacy of this moment will be measured by the concrete policy changes that emerge from the shadows of this particular tragedy, moving beyond rhetoric into the realm of enforceable law. We must demand a federal mandate for independent investigations in all cases where a government agent causes the death of a citizen, removing the conflict of interest that currently plagues the system. Furthermore, there must be absolute protection for whistleblowers within these agencies who come forward to expose the manufacture of false narratives or the suppression of vital video evidence. The fear of institutional retaliation must be replaced by the certainty of legal protection for those who choose truth over loyalty to a flawed system. These structural reforms are not an indictment of law enforcement as a profession but a necessary evolution to ensure that the profession remains worthy of the public's trust. In the final analysis, the story of Renee Good and the advocacy of Pramila Jayapal serve as a profound reminder that the rule of law is a living, breathing entity that requires constant defense. The integrity of our system is not maintained by the silence of the governed, but by the courage of those who speak truth to power in the face of overwhelming odds. As we close this chapter of inquiry, the message to federal institutions is clear. The era of the alternative reality is over, and the era of accountability has begun. The truth is not a flexible commodity to be traded for political stability. It is the bedrock upon which our entire democratic experiment is built. By honoring the facts of what happened to Renee Good, we honor the principles that make our nation a beacon of justice in an often darkened world.